right, everybody. Hello and welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're ready for this conversation. We're talking about the police today. Now, if you're like me, you probably have lots of thoughts and ideas on the subject of policing, probably some intense emotions as well, and for me, lots of questions. My guest today can answer a lot of those questions. His name is Alex Vitale. He is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He's the author of a book called The End of Policing. I've seen this book all over the place all of a sudden. It came out in 2017, but I think because of the George Floyd moment, the Derek Chauvin trial, and all the subsequent attention around policing, Professor Vitale has had a sort of public hearing in recent months. And it's interesting because, you know, as someone who's had a podcast talking about the radical left politics for a while, the subject of abolitionism and, you know, defunding the police is one that's been on the left for a long time. These ideas have been circulating, but they've also been building and building into the place where all of a sudden ordinary Americans are hearing these words and asking questions about what they mean. And Professor Vitale tells us a lot about sort of like why that is and how this has been an evolution, you know, how there's a history to this, how the role of American policing has expanded in the last 40 years, in particular, and particularly to becoming the primary mode through which the state deals with socio-economic problems produced by capitalism, from mass homelessness to drug addiction and mental illness. It's a story that more Americans ought to know so that we can sort of get out of the mythology of what the police do, because what they're doing is managing problems that ought to be managed in a different way. And Professor Vitale has really great ideas and has a lot of detail to give us on how both policing has evolved and how the movements against policing have evolved, and why 2021 is such a particularly powerful moment in that evolution. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We have lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there, including my new video lecture series on the history of the Vietnam War called Nom TV. The first episode is up now for our subscribers on Patreon. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I just taught my last classes at the schools I'm teaching at this semester. So this summer I'm just looking forward to doing nothing but making Nom TV episodes. So I hope you'll join me for that. It's something very, very different, and something very different from anything I've even done on Nostalgia Trap. So if you want to check that out and support the project, I really appreciate it. We are a totally independent media operation here. So again, you do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much to all the people that are subscribing. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Alex Vitale. Okay, Alex Vitale, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk with you. I've seen your face and the name of your book everywhere lately. It must be quite a moment for you. But it's funny because your book came out in 2017. It's called The End of Policing. I wonder, as far as those different moments, why did you write this book in 2017? What was the immediate context? Because I think part of what I'd love to talk to you about is sort of your longer arc of thinking about homelessness and policing for a long time. But why in 2017 did you write The End of Policing?
So, of course, I didn't write it in 2017. That's when it came out. But, you know, book publishing is a somewhat slow endeavor. So I actually had to deal with Verso Books to write this in like 2014 and begin to like collect things. You know, I had some ideas and some notes and some research and file folders. But I began writing it really in earnest around 2014. And it was then that Mike Brown happens and Eric Garner is killed and all the rest. And so what I did was I actually put the book, in a sense, aside. And I said to the editors, look, there's no way we can get the book out in the next 6 months or even the next year, because I got to write it. It's got to be proofed. It's got to be printed, publicity, blah, blah, blah. So instead, what I did is I just started writing op-eds, in part based on the research that I had already done or sections of the book I had already written. So I had these ready-made sort of ideas and research that could be turned into a 1,500-word piece for the Nation or something. And I was writing those about every 10 days for like 2 years. And this also gave me a chance to kind of try ideas out. And just be in touch with the conversation in real time. Because my experience, and this gets to maybe your original question, my experience with the issue of policing and protest against policing and efforts to change policing was that it was episodic, very localized, often lacked a long-term analysis, wasn't rooted often in long-term organizing. There are, of course, exceptions to this, and credit to all the amazing folks who kept some of these ideas alive in communities. But my concern was that within a few months, these movements might evaporate in large part, and the conversation will be over. So I was like, I got to intervene now in real time. And in terms of like why this book at that time, like before Ferguson happens, I had been watching the developments in the prison abolition movement. I had been an early participant supporter of critical resistance and some of these struggles. And my concern was that there wasn't a lot of conversation about policing. And, no one goes to prison unless they've been arrested by the police. And police are responsible for all kinds of harms on their own, like killing 1,000 people a year and all kinds of other problematic behaviors. So my feeling was, well, I'm writing this as an intervention in this kind of anti-mass incarceration, prison abolition movement to say, hey, policing is over here, and we need to integrate this a little bit more fulsomely into our analysis.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting because it seems like you mentioned the editorials and the public conversation. It seems like your work in part is about creating a conversation. The cover of your book has the thesis sort of written out. I love that I don't know if that's technically the subtitle of the book, but it has the thesis sort of written right on the cover of the book, which is incredible. And that I just want to read it because it says the problem is not police training, police diversity, or police methods. The problem is the dramatic and unprecedented expansion and intensity of policing in the last 40 years, a fundamental shift in the role of police in society. The problem is policing itself. How much were you sort of interested in creating a conversation or being sort of I don't know if I hate the word controversial, but there's sort of the end of policing idea is something that if you're not on the left and you haven't been following these conversations for years and years can sound, I think, completely out of nowhere to people. How much are you aiming at that audience, I guess, is my question.
So the cover was produced by Andy Schau, my editor at Verso Books, and in conversation with folks there and with myself. And Andy was quite self-consciously trying to evoke some of the public books of the period of the 1960s and 70s, even the 1950s, when people actually read books about popular issues in large numbers, where there was a lot of information on the cover that was, trying to intervene in a public conversation. And this, and I intentionally chose a non-academic press to do this. I was interested in engaging in a kind of public sociology, if you will. And, I was already just about a tenured I was already tenured. I was up for full professor. I didn't need, in a sense, to write another technical academic book. I had done that, written in the article, in the professional journals and whatnot. I wanted to intervene in a popular conversation. And so the whole tone of the book, the style of writing was designed for a more reachable style that would be accessible. Sorry, is the word I was looking for,
Yeah.
to a broader audience without trying to talk down to people or dumb it down. And it's of course filled with hundreds of endnotes and is a resource for scholars as well as activists and the general public. And it was very much my intention to do this. My own career, as you maybe alluded to, was rooted in public policy work before academia. And so I had been doing that kind of short form writing for many years. And, frankly, feel that one of the problems with popular discourse in the United States is the lack of real academic intervention, because academics are rewarded for writing in technical journals that no one reads.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on this program.
Yeah, there's just absolutely no reward for doing what I did.
Yeah,
and I'm receiving, in essence, no real professional advantage, even though the book is a bestseller and I'm on TV.
Isn't that a weird thing about academia that if you do become success, your ideas do become popular, within the sort of wider culture, that doesn't really have anything to do with your career and doesn't really do anything for you professionally. We also talk a lot about the fact that there's just this army of adjuncts and contingent academics who aren't even going to be in that world of trying to write for technical journals. They are sort of writing for popular audiences. I wonder how that will change in the future. I'm wondering about this sort of your trajectory.
I think it's already changing things.
Yeah.
Someone posted a really good list of like some of the really great interventions in this particular conversation and pointed out how many of them have been written by contingent academic workers.
Yeah.
And this is, as you point out, this is not an accident, and it's a real indictment of how the shrinking of opportunity has created an actual hardening of these barriers that are reinforced by this emphasis on access. Have you written in this journal? Because now that we have 500 applicants, we can further narrow the requirements in a way that further removes academia from popular conversations.
Well, I mean, the word that you I think hit upon a lot in your work is neoliberalism. It seems like that sort of direction, and the way you frame that around policing, I think is really, really interesting. Can you describe that? I know you've done this bit on NPR before, but I just think it's something that I wanted my listeners to hear from you. This idea that policing is sort of connected to the way we deal with social problems in capitalism in this era.
Yeah, there's a part of the story about the fundamental nature of policing that's rooted in this sort of 200-year-old story about slavery and colonialism and industrialization. But, we don't have slavery and colonialism in that 19th century sense in the U.S. anymore. We barely have industrialization. What we have is a kind of neoliberal austerity. And what I mean by that is that, in the 1970s, political leaders, industrial leaders make this decision to open up the economy to global competition in hopes of better taking advantage of various comparative advantages that American multinational corporations and banks and others had. So free trade of goods and financial services, but restrictions on movements to people, of course. And the hope is that some of these multinational actors would become so successful that, this would transform the economy for the good. And to do this, they had to deregulate. They created subsidies for the already most successful folks. And local places end up in this real bind, because if they don't have one of these new multinational players, they're now competing directly with China and Indonesia and Mexico and whatnot. So places like Detroit and Flint, Michigan, you had a previous guest talking about the situation in Flint, Michigan, which is super interesting. And we've all seen Michael Moore's movie on the subject.
That's right.
So cities don't want to end up like Flint or Detroit that are abandoned by these global flows of capital in this new global environment. So they try to subsidize whatever economic actors they can come up with to try to keep things going. So they cut taxes for them, give them subsidies, real estate deals. And to pay for this, they have to engage in austerity. They got to cut funding to schools, transit, cut employee salaries, reduce services across the board. That's neoliberal austerity. This idea that we're going to subsidize the already most successful players in hopes that some of their wealth will trickle down, but it didn't work. What it produced was, a lot of places, abandonment of neighborhoods, mass homelessness, untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods. And then these social problems, which are created as a result of economic policy matters, are then redefined as problems of crime and disorder. This is what the broken windows theory helps.
I was going to say, I hear that term in my head as you're talking here.
Exactly. Yeah. That's crucial to this and is intentional by its architects. They turn all these problems into questions of crime, disorder, moral deficiency to be managed through punitive interventions, policing, mass incarceration, jailing, turning social welfare delivery into these methods of punitive social control, et cetera. And so in that way, we can understand policing as a chief facilitator of austerity and of neoliberalism, which runs counter to this narrative we hear from some liberal apologists of policing that, well, defund the police just sounds like more austerity. And I'm like, you've got a very degraded analysis of what austerity is if you think that more money for police is how we get out of the austerity trap.
Well, it also just seems like that by dealing with issues like mass homelessness with police, it ensures that those issues are never going to go away. It seems like it's just a sort of cycle of jailing and incarceration and things.
It's a system for managing these problems, right? Not solving them. No amount of policing is solving homelessness, is solving the drug problems that we have, right? It's trying to put a lid on them to prevent them from interfering with these policies of neoliberal austerity so that rich people don't get mugged outside their favorite downtown restaurant, and so that, gentrifying neighborhoods are protected from homeless panhandlers and things like that. Without actually getting to the root of any of these real problems.
You, the cover of your book mentions the last 40 years. So I'm thinking of when you wrote the book, and somewhere in the mid 70s, is 40 years ago. Why that period? What changed in the 70s that left us in this situation?
So, we have a kind of fiscal crisis that occurs during this period in the early 70s. We have the oil shock. We have stagflation, we have the New York City fiscal crisis, and all of this is tied to a declining rate of profits that stems in part from this amazing period of middle-class economic growth, mass unionization that occurs in the immediate post-war period that puts a check on, top-level compensation. So that, you have an effective tax rate on the extremely wealthy of like 90% coming out of the Eisenhower era. And you've got unions pushing for real wage growth ahead of inflation. And so capital says, look, we're going to take advantage of this economic downturn by blaming it all on workers and saying it's the unions, they're too powerful. What we need is to break their power through offshoring of jobs, first to the maquiladoras in northern Mexico, which is the subject of kind of Roger and Me about Flint, but then eventually further afield as these trade deals get made to China, et cetera. And so that's what really drives this politics of austerity, is this crisis and this attempt by capital to renegotiate a better position for themselves. They were already making money. They just weren't making enough money, they felt. And they're like, we can squeeze people for more.
What about the development of a movement against this stuff? Because again, like I was young when the LA riots happened, right, in 1992, and I was in junior high. I had no context to understand it at all. Didn't even understand that there was a left at all that was working on these issues. It just seemed like the only people who were opposed to the police were people on the street that we were seeing on TV. But as I got older, I began to get more of a context, obviously, and going to the CUNY Graduate Center and things like that. But I'm thinking about like Angela Davis's book, "Are Prisons Obsolete?" which is another like kind of short little, almost aimed at a popular audience sort of book. But I'm wondering what the conversation was like. In other words, in the '70s, from the '70s to today, because it's kind of incredible to all of a sudden see in 2021 words and phrase like defund the police and the level of resistance we see in like social media is something that was very rarely present before. But I know that there were people working on this issue for a long time, particularly around abolitionism. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, because you mentioned that before, that like the abolitionism was focused most on mass incarceration and prisons. What was the sort of evolution of resistance against the police? Because it seems like it's reached a very different moment that it's at now. I mean, we've gone through like, diversity training, all the things you mentioned, like all these different things that the police have done to reform themselves means that they've had pressure to reform themselves for many, many years. And it hasn't changed the situation. So I wonder what is that left movement? What have they been up to for all these years?
So let's think about this transition to neoliberal austerity, right? It's accomplished in the U.S. in large part by the Reagan administration by breaking the back of labor, most centrally symbolically with the PATCO strike, in which he fires all the striking air traffic controllers. And this sends a message to the labor movement about their new diminished political position. Same thing happens in the UK under Thatcher, and the target there is the mine workers. And it's an intentional effort to crush those unions, not because of the particulars of those struggles, but they needed to crush a union, a powerful union, to establish the hegemony of this new regime of labor management through offshoring, deregulation, and breaking the unions. So what that does is that creates a very narrow kind of business unionism in a weak and threatened labor movement. And this diminishes the left across the board in the same way that the McCarthyism of the 1950s drives a real stake in the heart of labor power. So this is a further eroding of labor power. This means that historical movements that connected labor and community struggles become severed. And what we see is the labor movement devolve into, electing moderate Democrats in hopes that things won't get any worse. And then communities left on their own to some extent. And out of some of these, especially Black and brown, poor communities, a new politics is emerging. It's not completely new, right? Because it goes back to W. Du Bois, it goes back to, slavery abolition, et cetera. These are not completely new ideas, but they're percolating in new ways. And communities are beginning to say, if we're on our own in an extent, we want to look at things like community control. And ultimately, we want to stop this burgeoning mass incarceration. And so they begin to have this critique that says, we're poor because of these systematic social forces acting on us. And then we're being turned into criminals and driven into the criminal justice system. And this is making our lives worse. And so we need to start thinking about what successful communities would look like, what real freedom, racial justice would look like. And that means getting that system off our back. But they often they don't always have that fuller economic analysis that would have been more central to, let's say, the labor movement, which is thinking about these bigger issues.
Yeah.
So what's exciting about this moment is that we're beginning to see these things come together. Now, this has not happened. This was beginning to happen. The AFL-CIO just drafted a terrible report on policing that defended police unions, that is a totally inadequate take on the nature of the problem. So we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But individual, local, some unions are beginning to see this. And also the movement is not just angry at killer cops. It's beginning to make these connections to these broader economic questions. Again, some places have been doing this for a long time, or some individuals and communities have been a voice saying, hey, but now it's really taking off. There's a much more receptive audience. This is becoming the basis of concrete organizing, and it's really changing the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it seems extraordinary in a lot of ways. At the same time, I remember, years and years of feeling like no one cared about this issue except at particular viral moments, if that makes sense. I mean, it's still tied to viral moments in a lot of ways, and I wonder what we think of the utility of that, because it's so. I had a conversation about this a few years ago with students at Brooke College, and in my class about policing, and someone said, "Well, now that we have cameras on our phones, we'll be able to basically capture all of this stuff on video, and that will essentially end the problem because police will know they're being watched. But we have body cameras. That seems like one of the solutions was body camera. In other words, my students had a deep faith that the body cameras and the sort of surveillance society would end this situation, but it seems like it hasn't. Although it has produced viral moments that have led to these tremendous moments of discourse. So it's I don't know. I'm conflicted about it. That part.
Well, see, I think some folks are still trapped in a kind of liberal worldview that imagines that there is such a thing as good, just policing in service of some good social order, and that what's needed to achieve that is just to implement the kinds of liberal checks and balances that we're taught about in civics classes. Various oversight and accountability mechanisms. But this was really a pretty limited understanding of the reality of these dynamics, right? That the vast majority of the harms that emerge out of policing are completely lawful and procedurally proper and exactly what the police are being asked to do. The war on drugs is completely without any redeeming values, even when it's performed in a procedurally proper and unbiased manner. It's fundamentally unjust, and it doesn't even have to kill anyone to produce these massive levels of injustice. And a body camera or a citizen phone camera is not going to change that in any way, unfortunately. Mm. So we need an analysis that really more fundamentally takes on this idea that we need to solve our problems through the implementation of policing. And of course, even how we define what is a problem, et cetera, needs to be interrogated as well. So, I mean, the good news is that a lot of people are seeing that.
Yeah.
That the discourse is changing from jail killer cops to defund the police. And that's not just because of viral moments, that's because of organizing. Mm. There's a reason why no one was holding up a sign this summer saying more money for body cameras or more money for implicit bias training. The reason the signs all said defund the police is because in hundreds of cities across the country, that's what people have been organizing around. They may have not have been using that particular 3-word hashtag, mm-hmm. but they were like, oh, we want to close down the jail and redistribute those funds to community interventions to make the community safer. We want to shut down the use of police in sex work or the war on drugs or whatever, and actually invest in drug treatment services. We want to get the police out of the schools, out of the mental health business. And so these were very real campaigns that weren't getting any national attention. So people just thought all of this came out of nowhere in the summer. And because the book had come out in 2017, I had spent, 3 years on the road every other week I was on the road every other week visiting these cities because they wanted me to come to help advance these movements in whatever small way I
These
could.
groups? Because I know you're involved with one at Brooklyn College, but who are the people and the organizations that are sort of at the forefront of this? Because I think, to me, that's such an important idea, that the defund the police didn't just organically come out of the ether at a George Floyd protest with someone holding a sign, but it's the result of people working. Which is often kind of the boring story. We don't want to hear about social justice and things like that. But who are the people that are creating the defund movement?
Well, let's look at things like the Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis, which is kind of
Yeah.
spearheaded by a group called Action St. Louis and an amazing organizer, Kayla Reed, who was part of the Ferguson uprising and was, working temp jobs and retail and just decided to become a full-time activist, and has helped transform the politics of the city by going into communities and saying, we've got a better idea for public safety than throwing all our young people into this decrepit jail, which is ruining their lives. And so they've had tremendous success, both policy-wise and in getting better people elected. There's the Black Organizing Project in Oakland, which has spent years looking at the harms of school policing, has been organizing students and their parents. And this summer, they won an agreement to get the Oakland Police Department out of the city school system, to hire more counselors. There were groups in Minneapolis, Reclaim the Block, MPD 150, that were doing the research, laying out alternative budgets, talking concretely about how money could be shifted from policing to community needs in ways that would concretely improve public safety. So all this stuff had been going on for years before George Floyd was killed.
In terms of its connection to the big, I think the big organization that people think of when they think of policing right now is Black Lives Matter, which emerged from the Mike Brown Ferguson event.
Well, it actually emerges in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it is already in existence at some level when Mike Brown happens. And that's why, in part, they were able to channel so much energy into supporting that movement and growing it across the country. And that's really part of what's been different about this moment. It's not just a new analysis, but the level of sustained organizing. It wasn't just Mike Brown was killed, so there were 2 or 3 months of protests and then a few superficial reforms, and then it kind of collapses. No, the organizing has been continual and ongoing, and it's really about a new civil rights movement.
Yeah, yeah.
And whether Black Lives Matter, I think, is best understood as a kind of shorthand for a movement. There's the movement for Black Lives. There are lots of specific organizations as well. And there are local Black Lives Matter groups. Anyway, the landscape of the organizations is complicated, but in general, there's just a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing going on. And that's what's making all of this possible.
How important is the racial lens on not only policing but the resistance too? Because it seems like so much of the resistance to policing is sort of couched within that racial lens. How does that function? Because in terms, it leads me to think that a lot of like white Americans or Americans who are antagonistic to these ideas are thinking, well, this is a black movement. This is a movement about black people, and the problem is that the police are racist, and that's that. But it seems like you're identifying something a little bit larger, that like the racism of the police is a structure and a symptom of something that's connected to economic. To sort of the economic neoliberalism that you're describing. How do we get through that muddle? Because it seems like it's one that obviously has plagued the left forever. I'm not bringing up anything new here, but it seems like a tricky, complicated thing to navigate when you're trying to bring a movement that convinces all Americans that this is something we got to change right now.
Well, I don't have any magic solution to the tensions that you've identified here, and they're very real. So on the one hand, part of the power of this moment is to make real the ongoing existence of anti-Black racism in the United States. there was this myth making after Obama's elected that we're now in a post-racial moment, which was just bullshit at the time, and has been made much clearer now. And so there is this profound need for a racial reckoning in relationship to mass incarceration and policing, but also all kinds of core economic issues, including the funding of essential services for communities of color. But I don't think we're going to win this solely on a discourse of ending anti-Black racism. First of all, economic inequality in the United States is not only a problem for Black people. Neither is police violence and mass incarceration. The actual population that suffers the most disproportionately from police violence are Native American communities. And that legacy of settler colonialism remains even more obscured from public conversation, I think, than anti-Black racism does. And of course, the status of Latinos and South Asian and the role of Islamophobia. But also look at the way that policing has become this terrible problem in poor white rural communities. The war on drugs is alive and well in these places. It's not the same as the policing of Black communities. There's always that extra racial tax, if you will. But I think that especially if we have an analysis that says that, look, policing makes possible a whole set of systems of economic exploitation that are producing inequality across the board, destroying the planet, ramping up militarism, right? We are all affected by this system. Now, we're not all affected the same way, to the same degree, but I think if we're going to build a movement that's capable of changing this, we're going to have to create the possibilities for solidarity beyond just anti-Black racism.
I agree.
Right? So, but we don't want to lose the centrality of that discourse about anti-Black racism, which has been so obscured. And every day I'm confronted by police leaders who well, structural racism, we don't even think such a thing is possible, right? There are individuals who make individual decisions, and there are no racist police officers in my department, and structural racism is something in your imagination. And as Margaret Thatcher once said, society isn't even a real thing. That's just something you
no such thing as society. Yeah. Well, I mean, we got a lot of reactionaries in America, and you think about the homeless population and attitudes towards the homeless population, how much that's individualized in American ideology and American culture. It feels like a lot of people who aren't police almost share the same attitude as the police. In other words, it's become a sort of police attitude society towards people and the decisions they make and the drugs they do and all that sort of thing. But we also have, I wonder about the other side of it. We talk about the left and the resistance, but there's also just Blue Lives Matter, and that sort of pro-police attitude that seems pervasive among the middle class. I think maybe that's changing.
You mean those people who were beating cops to death on Capitol Hill?
Man, I live in the suburbs in Southern California. I lived in Brooklyn for many, many years, but now I live in the suburbs, and I see the bumper stickers, the Blue Lives Matter bumper stickers, and the running over protesters bumper stickers. And it's a pretty vicious discourse, honestly. And it seems like, I wonder how much of that is defensive, because Blue Lives Matter is directly sort of taking Black Lives Matter and turning it into something for the police. But it seems like the police are not only defensive, but they're connected to a population. Like you mentioned, MAGA and the 1-6 thing. There's something going on where there's a fight, and I don't expect the police to just sort of lay back and accept the defunding sort of attacks.
So this is one of the limitations of imagining that we're going to fix this by somehow neutralizing police unions as this authoritarian voice.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was my real question.
because the police unions are only powerful because they represent a whole nexus of right-wing authoritarian interests. It's not the union per se. The union's just a convenient embodiment of a set of politics. And if you could break their unions, they will just create informal associations, and other actors on the authoritarian right will step in to fill that institutional void, which is what things like the John Birch Society and the KKK and various anti-communist groups of the
that's such a scary thought.
All of which were this intersection, all of which were heavily populated with police officers and police leaders, right? And so we have to just directly take on authoritarianism as a political ideology, and and expose what thin blue line really means, right? It's a worldview. It's this idea that the world is divided between good people and bad people. It's this very simplistic Manichaean worldview, and that police exist to do the separating, deciding who's on which side of the line and Xing out those on the wrong side of the line. And this is an incredibly dangerous and also completely inaccurate worldview. And it's rooted in, racist authoritarianism. And so that's why we do want to neutralize, their power in as many ways as we can. We do want to say to politicians, look, you can't say that you took the police endorsement because you're pro-union. That doesn't fly. These are not part of the labor movement. They shouldn't be part of the labor movement. Their politics are antithetical to the interests of working people in a broader sense, and that their support is disqualifying for us.
Is that a controversial idea? The idea that the police union, because I've seen it a lot on the left. Sort of like police unions are not really working class unions. They don't really count. But it seems like the police union in some ways is one of the more successful unions in winning benefits and concessions from their bosses.
So part of the problem here is that as a result of the McCarthyism of the 50s and the union breaking of the 80s, is that we have this incredibly degraded notion of what the labor movement is.
Yeah,
it's this narrow, simplistic business unionism. So if that's what we understand a union as, then we see, police, get their little 2% pension increases and their workplace rule protections. And so they're just like the bus drivers and the teachers and the sanitation workers. But that's because the bus drivers, teachers, and sanitation workers are not functioning like a real union. They don't have a real agenda for worker power. Their struggles are not rooted in communities. And it turns out that when they are, like the Chicago Teachers Union, they typically take a pretty strong stand against policing.
Yeah, right.
And then the police are used against them. And this contradiction becomes clear. So part of what's the problem here is we need a reinvigorated labor movement that will make clear just how antithetical these police unions are to the interests of working people.
That's such a compelling idea, and it's something that seeing the way that people responding to all these sort of signs that are on restaurants that say no one wants to work anymore right now, and there's sort of like this idea that there are people that are talking about the quality of jobs and the quality of life in a way that's beyond just a 2% wage increase. It seems like COVID actually forced a conversation about what we do for a living, and not only that, but how much we sacrifice, especially service workers, to go put themselves in danger in order to make profits for restaurant owners who are sitting there, making profits and refusing to share it. And it seems it's to me kind of extraordinary. I wonder how that feels for you, because your book came out in 2017 and it was received in a different way that it's being received now. It seems like there are more people from the mainstream media, whatever that is, that want to hear your ideas, if that makes sense. So
there was a moment in the early summer where these protests were erupting and everyone was holding these signs saying defund the police, and the mainstream media and everybody else was trying to figure out, well, what the hell is this? And conveniently, I literally wrote an entire book explaining what that is. So myself and a lot of other people had access to mainstream media platforms for about 3 weeks.
The magic moment.
So, I got to put out my take on that, which was fantastic. And I was obviously very happy to do it, and to do it in conjunction with a whole community of people doing this work. That interest has largely diminished. Even by mid-summer, the mainstream media decided that defund the police was outside of acceptable discourse, that it might be a threat to the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and they mostly all wanted to get rid of Trump. And so, I still get calls from newspapers to comment on stories about this or that, but there are no more invitations to be on CNN.
Wow. So defund the police had it
shut down.
Defund the police had its public airing. You're saying it was rejected by the powers that be as anything realistic. They said it's not polling right, it's not supported by evidence, etc. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is, to me, that sort of like validates the radicalism of the idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and it's not such a big deal because, the movement wasn't the objective of the movement at that point. We had this really nice gathering last January, a year ago, in Miami, of folks from around the country who were doing this on the ground organizing, and no one even talked about the national election. We were, policing is a local matter, local budgets. We knew that the general public was not really ready for these ideas. We needed to do more base building. So we were catapulted onto the front pages and into the electronic media, and we did the best we could to try to explain these ideas and to create some space. And I think we're remarkably effective. People like Patrice Cullors and Derica Purnell and really are opening up the discourse to these ideas. And that in some ways makes the on the ground organizing a little easier because people have maybe heard some of these ideas a little bit.
Yeah.
So now people are back to focusing really on the base building. So lots of local struggles around budget priorities.
I'm interested in your own evolution on these issues, in part because reading about you being in the 90s in San Francisco, working with the homeless population there. And, I remember watching The Real World on MTV in the 90s with the sort of the scene in San Francisco being a very specific kind of scene in the 90s. But I'm wondering what was the path? It seems like the path for you was through thinking about homelessness as a social problem. How did you get involved in that? Because the part of me thinks about you're a person like me that sort of started in the West, right, and then came to the CUNY Graduate Center in the 2000s. Is that right?
I moved. So my undergraduate education is in New England. So I went to Hampshire College, and I did a lot of work at Smith College, which is part of this 5-college interchange. And my undergraduate degree is in urban anthropology. And I was an urbanist. And I was studying like urban enterprise zones and community-based housing programs and economic development strategies. And I went to California after school and got a job at the Homeless Coalition doing housing policy and social services spending, and going to budget hearings. And at that time, no one in academia or policy was really paying that much attention to what was going on in the criminal legal system. That was something that criminologists studied. And so what I saw emerge in the early 90s was that San Francisco, like a lot of other cities during this period, basically gave up on the idea that they were going to really do anything about homelessness and decided to just turn it over to the police to manage, and some shelters and a social services archipelago, whatever, but that none of which were designed to solve homelessness. And so this forced me to really think about the interconnection between policing and poverty and these larger questions about the directions of cities. And then I decided to go back to school in part to think about global cities and how to produce how can local spaces resist globalization and this race to the bottom? And so I decided to go to the Graduate Center to work with some urbanists and Stanley Aronowitz and others who are thinking about these globalization questions right when Giuliani gets elected in New York.
Oh, yeah.
And this, again, turning social problems into crime problems and then handing it all to police was just amped up to another level. And I was like, well, I know exactly what's going on here because I just lived through it in San Francisco. And so then I began trying to put these pieces together. And that's reflected in my first book, City of Disorder, about the rise of Giuliani and the interconnection between, failed economics and repressive policing.
How much, having thought about, Giuliani was an entryway into me thinking about these issues too. And I think Bloomberg even more so, because I was at the CUNY Graduate Center later than you. I started there in 2004 and it was done in 2011. And that period was an education for me because I hadn't lived in New York City before. And I'm from Ventura, California, a pretty small town north of Los Angeles. So it was an introduction to urbanity and sort of the idea of city policing. But God, watching Giuliani's evolution into the figure, the sort of cartoonish Nazi figure he is now with Trump, seems bizarre, but also seems absolutely sort of consistent with what his leadership in New York City was like, if that makes sense.
So, Giuliani runs in 89 and loses. And he runs on this kind of vague thing about, well, I fought the mob and I'll, do a better job of representing the neighborhoods. And, it was clearly a rebuke to this idea that Dinkins could represent the whole city, but it wasn't a fully formed idea. And during the intervening years, the Manhattan Institute, which is a right-wing neoliberal conservative think tank funded by hedge fund guys and billionaires who don't want to pay any taxes, they say, look, we can do something with this guy. So they feed him the broken windows theory, quite consciously and intentionally. And they say, here's the way you do it, is you talk about crime and disorder endlessly and how you're going to solve those problems. And part of the reason that this is successful is because Dinkins doesn't really have a different program, especially on economics. The economic policies of Giuliani and Dinkins end up looking almost the same. They both have completely capitulated to this neoliberal austerity regime. The difference is that Giuliani says, I can clean up the streets. I can manage these disorder problems by turning them over to police. While Dinkins says, well, we need to be tolerant. We need to accept that people are hurting. The problem is the federal government won't give us enough money. And Giuliani's like, I'm not worried about any of that. I'm just going to round people up and put them into Rikers Island. And that'll be the end of that. And people are like, that works for me.
Oh, there's something really thinking about the way that, like, just the racial element of that, like following Dinkins, because it reminds me of like Trump following Obama, right? And sort of using the
very similar.
Yeah, using the language of reaction, and yet there's sort of a through line too underneath.
Yep.
Like, oh God.
Well, this is the crisis, what I call the crisis of urban liberalism.
Yeah,
which is that we don't have a deep left program for cities. So if people say, oh, well, don't you all have Democratic mayors and they're using the police? And I'm like, yeah, but they're all neoliberals. They're all neoliberals. They're not anti-austerity. They've capitulated to all this nonsense. What we need is a new urbanism that is rooted in a different vision about economic development, that isn't giving the whole store away to a few multinational corporations in hopes that something will trickle down to the rest of us.
Well, we did a series of shows on when Amazon tried to come to Long Island City, and sort of the resistance from City University of New York students and faculty and others that in the community that basically said no to that. And it it corresponds a little to what we're talking about here, which feels like there are people who are making these connections.
Yes.
And it seemed like Amazon coming to Long Island City and saying, we're going to put our headquarters here. A lot of people called bullshit on that and felt like you can just look at New York City. In the 15 years that I lived there, I watched it transform the skyline into all these luxury towers with homeless people piled up on the bottom of them and these like sort of really ugly sort of consumer world of yogurt shops and stuff like that. I mean, the fabric of New York City changed. The physical landscape changed very into a really sort of very corporate environment in the 2000s.
And it did feels not like produce broad prosperity.
Not at all. Right. It feels like more people know that than ever before.
Well, that's why, this victory was successful, right? But also because as a sign of the growing support for these ideas is that you have people like AOC in Congress and the ranks of the squad are increasing. There's been amazing transformation in St. Louis that I alluded to before, including just recently the election of a new, much more progressive mayor. And I think these folks are acutely aware of these questions and are working hard to try and figure it out. They see that policing facilitates austerity. They see that the unions are hurting and that we need to create a new kind of urban politics that doesn't just rely on Amazon and Morgan Stanley Chase and all the rest, right? And I don't think they've figured it out yet, but they're beginning that process. And I think we need to keep putting more people like that in office to create the possibility of moving in a different direction.
I agree. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. I will throw out one more idea out here that's kind of one of the more complicated ones, but it's kind of like this. Bernie Sanders just the other day just said, what we have to stop everything we're doing right now to think about Trump and his sort of movement to attack the structures of our democracy. In other words, there's this notion that we get more AOCs and Bernies and the squad in there and sort of like but there's also like a real strain of fascism within this country that's growing, that's connected to the police, that's saying we're going to stop people from voting. We're going to stop people from participating in this democratic system because we're threatened by it now. And that to me seems like the terrain of the future in some ways is partly a fight over the actual sort of power of the democracy and the institutional power itself, because the Republican Party seems like it's moving towards basically saying, if we lose, we're going to not recognize that. And we're not going to certify elections anymore if Democrats win.
Well, the solution to that, like the solution to the other, has to be rooted in community mobilization, right? Unfortunately, the labor unions have not proven up to the task. I hope they will come around, but we've got to adapt some of their tactics about face-to-face organizing, building institutional power. But we need to do that at the community level. We need to build organizational power, and that's how we're going to change people's minds and grow the movement. And that's how we're going to operationalize power. Whether it's at the ballot box or through, becoming ungovernable and refusing to go along with this nonsense anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I just mean that the right feels that way too. Is the sort of like, it feels like the Capitol that you mentioned what a contradiction there is there at the Capitol with like, the reactionaries that are attacking the police and even killing the police. There's something really deep about that, it seems like.
Look, people are hurting.
Yeah.
People are hurting. This system is not working for them either. Some of them, some of these right-wing forces are trying to hold on to privileges that they've historically enjoyed, and they're doing okay. But, people done some research about the Capitol folks. They've had bankruptcies. They've had mortgages that they couldn't pay. There's a deep insecurity there. And mainstream democratic liberalism has nothing to offer them.
No.
And that's, and Sanders did. Right. Sanders was kind of actually spoke to some of that insecurity for them. So that's what we need to keep trying to figure out.
Yeah.
It's not pandering to them, but also not imagining that we're going to just suppress them through like anti-terror legislation or something like that. No, we have to enact a positive aspirational politics for real economic, racial, and social justice. And we have to see that we have to make sure that it speaks to the experiences of folks in the flyover states, because they're getting screwed over by multinational corporations and banks too, that have degraded their environment, allowed the infrastructure to deteriorate, taken all the jobs away, turned agriculture over to agribusiness, poisoned the environment. There's a lot to say to those people, but the mainstream Democrats are getting money from agribusiness and the chemical companies, and they don't have a robust analysis about what's going on in Middle America.
Yeah, it seems like the answer always is sort of make a better society is the way to deal with these things. And yeah, I agree that any sort of attempt to, the Trump is sort of using the words cancel culture and things like that to sort of build this idea that he's being suppressed by the state and, taking away the Twitter account and all that stuff. It seems like it does fuel reaction. This is tricky stuff. But I just wanted to thank you for sharing your ideas, because your book is something that you say that the mainstream has sort of considered it and has moved on. But I see your ideas and I see your book everywhere, and defund the police as a larger idea is something that seems like it's operative in a way that I've never seen in my life. So something's happening. It's hard to predict where it'll go. But.
Well, thank you, David. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. All right, that is going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Alex Vitale. Go pick up his book, The End of Policing. I think it's a terrific entry into the whole conversation, and one that makes these ideas very, very accessible, and in the best way, makes radical ideas seem like common sense. So thank you to Alex Vitale for coming on the show and talking with us about this stuff. To me, it's the terrain of the future in more ways than one. So thanks for that. And I just wanted to say again that thank you to the subscribers of the show that are keeping the show running. Couldn't do it without you, and we've got lots of bonus material up on the Patreon for those that are supporting the show. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, including the first episodes of Nom TV, which I will be putting up throughout the summer. Come and join us. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.